The rain in Black Creek didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. It fell in sheets of gray, relentless and cold, drumming against the corrugated tin roofs of the shanties and turning the main thoroughfare into a churning river of black sludge. The air tasted of sulfur from the mines and the sour, wet rot of unseasoned timber. Alara Vance stood on an overturned crate in the center of the muddy square, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together. She was soaked through. Her calico dress, once a cheerful yellow, was now a translucent mud-splattered rag that clung to her distended belly like a second skin. 8 months. She was 8 months along, carrying a child that felt heavier with every passing second, a stone weight pulling her down toward the muck. Her ankles were swollen to the size of grapefruits, throbbing in boots that had split at the seams weeks ago. A dull, grinding ache radiated from her lower back, a constant reminder of the burden she carried alone, but the physical pain was a mercy compared to the burning shame that scorched her cheeks, hot enough to dry the rain. Around her, a crowd of miners, trappers, and their hollow-eyed wives huddled under the dripping eaves of the mercantile. They watched her with the dull bovine curiosity of cattle watching a slaughter. There was no pity in their eyes, only a grim calculation. In Black Creek, a widow with debt was a commodity. A pregnant widow was a liability. Mr. Gantry, the town banker, paced in front of her crate. He wore a black frock coat that was surprisingly dry, likely due to the umbrella held by his nervous clerk. Gantry tapped his cane against the side of the crate. Thwack, 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 a rhythm that sounded like a gavel sentencing her to death. "Look here," Gantry shouted, his voice shrill over the hiss of the rain. "Alara Vance, widow of Thomas Vance, God rest his soul, though he left a mountain of debt behind him. The bank is calling in the loan, folks. The law says the debt must be paid in coin or service." He gestured to Alara with the tip of his cane, pointing at her belly, as if it were a defect in a piece of livestock. "Now I know what you're thinking," Gantry sneered, scanning the crowd. "She's heavy. She's slow, but she's young, and once she drops that burden, she'll be fit for scrubbing floors, mending nets, or—" he paused, a lecherous grin twisting his thin lips, "providing other comforts to a lonely man." A few men chuckled darkly. A woman in the back spat into the mud. Alara wrapped her arms around her stomach, trying to shield the unborn life from their words. "Don't listen," she whispered internally to the baby. "Don't hear them." "Do I hear $10 for her contract?" Gantry asked. $10 pays the bank and you get a servant for a year." Silence. The rain drummed harder. $5? Gantry's voice grew impatient. $5 for a cook? A washerwoman? A miner near the front spat a stream of tobacco juice near the crate. "I ain't paying $5 to feed 2 mouths, Gantry. She's gonna pop any day. Who's gonna feed the brat while she's wailing in childbed?" "She's damaged goods," another voice shouted. "Thomas probably died trying to feed that appetite of hers." Laughter. Cruel, jagged laughter that felt like stones being thrown. Alara closed her eyes. She wished the fever that had taken the others last winter would take her now. She wished the mine had collapsed on her instead of Thomas. To be sold like a mule, and to be rejected like a broken one. It was a depth of hell she hadn't known existed. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. Gantry's face turned a mottled purple. The silence of the crowd was an insult to his authority. He hated losing money, and Thomas Vance's debt was a stain on his ledger. He intended to scrub out. He turned to Alara. The veneer of the businessman cracked, revealing the bully beneath. He stepped onto the crate, crowding her space. The smell of him, stale cigar smoke and bay rum, made Alara gag. "You're making this difficult, girl," Gantry hissed, grabbing her upper arm. His fingers dug into her soft flesh, pinching hard. "Stand up straight. Show them you're sturdy." Alara cried out, stumbling. The wet wood was slick. She slipped, her heavy center of gravity pulling her forward. Gantry didn't catch her. He yanked her arm, wrenching her shoulder, trying to force her upright. "If nobody buys your contract," Gantry shouted to the crowd, shaking her like a rag doll, "then the bank takes possession, and the only place the bank has for a woman in her condition is the company house down by the tracks. They aren't picky about belly size in the dark." The threat hung in the air, toxic and terrifying. The company house, a brothel for the desperate. "Please," Alara whimpered, the rain mixing with the tears on her face. "Mr. Gantry, please. I can sew, I can." "Quiet!" Gantry raised his hand as if to strike her. "You're property now, and failing property at that." He raised his hand higher. The crowd watched, silent accomplices. Then a low rumble vibrated through the square. It wasn't thunder. It was deeper, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, or from the throat of a predator so large it didn't need to roar to be heard. The crowd at the edge of the street parted. They didn't just step aside, they scrambled, tripping over themselves to get out of the way. A horse emerged from the gray mist. It was a Percheron draft horse, a beast of immense power, its coat the color of a bruise. Steam plumed from its nostrils in twin jets. Its hooves struck the mud with a sound like hammers hitting wet clay. Thud, squelch, thud. The rider was a mountain. He wore a coat made of unrefined grizzly fur, the pelt still holding the shape of the animal's massive shoulders. A hood shadowed his face, but beneath it, a beard as black as a coal seam tangled around a jaw set in stone. "Silas Thorne, the bear!" He didn't ride into town, he descended upon it. He pulled the massive horse to a halt 10 feet from the crate. The beast blew air, shaking its head, the bridle jingling with a sound that cut through the rain. Silas sat motionless. He looked at Gantry. Then he looked at Alara. His eyes were visible beneath the hood, amber, predatory, and burning with a cold, terrifying fire. He saw the hand gripping Alara's arm. He saw the bruise forming on her pale skin. He saw the way she curled around her belly, protecting it even as she fell. Gantry froze. His hand was still raised, but it trembled now. Mr. Thorne," he stammered, we didn't expect you down from the timberline until spring." Silas didn't speak. He shifted in the saddle. The leather groaned under his weight. He slowly dismounted. He landed in the mud with a heavy impact that splashed black sludge onto the onlooker's boots. He stood a full head taller than any man there. He smelled of pine resin, cold stone, and blood. He walked toward the crate. The crowd shrank back, pressing themselves against the wet walls of the buildings. Gantry released Alara's arm as if it burned him. He backed up to the edge of the crate. "Now, Silas, this is just business. Bank business. The widow here owes—" Silas stopped. He was close enough now that Alara could feel the heat radiating off him, a furnace in the freezing rain. He looked at Gantry. "Don't touch her," Silas growled. The voice was gravel grinding on bone. It wasn't a request. It was a command from a king to a peasant. I was just," Gantry squeaked, his cane shaking. Silas reached into the deep pocket of his bear coat. He pulled out a heavy leather pouch. It was stained and worn. He didn't hand it to Gantry. He tossed it. The pouch hit Gantry in the chest with the force of a brick. The banker gasped. The air knocked out of him, and he toppled backward off the crate, landing flat on his back in the mud. The pouch burst open. It wasn't gold dust. It was heavy, silvery white rocks, platinum ore, raw, unrefined, and worth more than the bank itself. "Debt paid," Silas rumbled. Gantry scrambled in the mud, clutching the ore, his greed warring with his terror. Yes, paid in full, more than full." Silas turned his back on the banker. He looked at Alara. Up close he was terrifying. A scar, jagged and white, ran from his temple down through his eye and into his beard, pulling his face into a permanent scowl. He looked wild, dangerous, a creature that belonged in the dark woods, not among people. Elara couldn't breathe. She looked up at him, her hand still clutching her belly. He bought me, she thought, panic spiking in her chest. The monster bought me. Can you walk? Silas asked. His voice was lower now, but no less rough. Elara tried to straighten, but her back spasmed. She cried out, grabbing the edge of the crate. I don't think so. Silas didn't sigh. He didn't roll his eyes. He simply stepped closer. Arm, he said. Elara hesitated. Put your arm around my neck, he commanded. She reached up, her trembling hand touching the rough, wet fur of his coat. Silas bent down. He scooped her up. He didn't lift her like a woman. He lifted her like a child. One massive arm went under her knees, the other around her back, careful, so incredibly careful not to press against her swollen stomach. He held her against his chest. He was hard as granite, but warm, so warm. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the bear carried the pregnant widow to his horse. He set her onto the saddle sideways, adjusting her skirts with a strange, clumsy gentleness. Hold the pommel, he ordered. He swung himself up behind her. The saddle creaked, but the huge horse stood firm. Silas wrapped one arm around her to grab the reins. For a moment, Elara was encased in him. The smell of the wild, that heat of his body, the terrifying strength of his arms caging her in. He kicked the horse. They turned away from the crate, away from gantries scrabbling for platinum in the mud, away from the town that had rejected her. They rode toward the timberline, into the gray mist and the silence of the high peaks. Elara closed her eyes and let the tears fall, terrified of the man who held her, yet grateful for the first time in months that she was no longer cold. The climb to the timberline was a slow, terrifying ascent into the throat of the storm. The rain that had turned Black Creek into a sewer transformed, mile by agonizing mile, into sleet, and then into hard driving snow that stung Elara's face like blown sand. She sat rigid within the circle of Silas Thorne's arms, terrified to move, terrified to lean back against the wall of bear fur and muscle that caged her in. The heat radiating from him was the only thing keeping her blood moving, a furnace burning against her frozen spine. He didn't speak. He navigated the treacherous, narrow switchbacks with a silent, terrifying competence, guiding the massive Percheron up-trails that looked like nothing more than goat paths clinging to the sheer granite face. Hours passed. The world turned gray, then white, then a deep bruised purple as evening fell. Finally, the horse crested a ridge that seemed to jut out over the edge of the world. Home, Silas grunted. The vibration of his voice against her back made Elara jump. She looked up. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. The cabin was built directly into a recess in the cliff face, utilizing the living rock as its rear wall. Logs the size of bridge pilings, darkened by age and creosote, formed the front and sides, chinked with river clay that had frozen hard as iron. There were no windows on the windward side, only a low, heavy door reinforced with iron straps that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. Silas halted the horse. The wind here was a physical weight screaming over the peaks. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped into the snow, which was already knee-deep. He didn't seem to notice the cold. He reached up. Come, he said. Elara hesitated. Her legs were numb, useless blocks of ice. Her belly felt like a lead weight dragging her down. Silas didn't wait. He reached up, his massive hands spanning her waist, careful, so agonizingly careful not to press the child, and lifted her. He didn't struggle. He didn't grunt. He pulled her from the saddle and held her suspended for a moment, looking at her with those amber eyes that seemed to strip away her defenses. Then he turned and carried her to the door. He kicked the wood thud to knock the ice loose from the jamb. He shoved it open with his shoulder. He carried her over the threshold and kicked the door shut behind them, dropping a heavy wooden bar into place. The roar of the wind was instantly cut off, replaced by a silence so profound it rang in Elara's ears. He set her down. Elara swayed, grabbing the back of a rough-hewn chair to steady herself. Her boots, soaked and frozen, felt like stones. The cabin was freezing. It smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, pine resin, and a metallic tang of gun oil. It was a single cavernous room. The back wall was the cliff face itself, weeping moisture that froze into glittering rivulets in the dim light. A massive stone hearth dominated the center, cold and dark. There was no softness here, no curtains, no rugs, just tools, traps hanging from the rafters like iron bats, and a bed in the corner piled high with furs. Silas ignored her. He moved with a frightening speed. He knelt by the hearth, striking flint to steel. Within seconds, a fire roared to life, feeding on the dry pitch pine he had stacked there. The light washed over the room, chasing back the shadows, but revealing the stark bachelor squalor of the place. He stood up, the firelight catching the white scar that bisected his face. He looked at Elara, who was still shivering by the door, a puddle of meltwater forming around her skirts. "Warm yourself," he ordered. He walked past her to a larder built into the stone wall. He pulled out a strip of dried venison and a hard biscuit. He tossed them onto the table. "Eat." He didn't ask if she liked venison. He didn't offer a plate. Elara moved toward the fire, drawn by the heat. Her teeth chattered. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas watched her. He seemed uncomfortable, his massive frame taking up too much space in the room. He looked at the bed, then at her swollen belly, then at the floor. "Bed is yours," he said abruptly, pointing a calloused finger at the corner. Elara froze. "Mr. Thorne, I cannot take your bed. The floor is... I have slept on floors before." "You are carrying," Silas growled, turning his back to her to hang up his coat. "Floor is cold, stone sucks the heat. You take the bed." "But where will you sleep?" He pointed a thumb at a pile of buffalo robes near the door. "I sleep where I guard." He didn't wait for an argument. He grabbed a bucket and headed for the door. "Water! Spring is frozen. Need to chip ice." He vanished back into the storm. Elara was alone. The silence pressed in on her. She looked around the cabin, her prison, or her sanctuary, she didn't know which. She looked at the venison. It was tough as shoe leather. Panic began to rise in her throat, sour and hot. "He bought me," she thought. "He paid platinum. He expects a return." She remembered Gantry's words. A servant, a cook. If she didn't work, she was useless. And in this world, useless things were discarded. She couldn't be discarded. Not with the baby coming. She needed this roof. She needed this fire. "I have to prove I'm worth the ore," she told herself, wiping the tears from her cheeks with freezing fingers. "I have to earn my keep." She looked around. The floor was covered in pine needles and dirt tracked in from the outside. The table was dusted with grit. She saw a broom made of bound twigs leaning against the wall. Elara grabbed it. Her back screamed in protest as she bent to pick up a dropped piece of firewood. A sharp, stabbing pain shot down her leg, the baby pressing on a nerve. She gasped, clutching her stomach, but she forced herself to straighten. "Work," she whispered. "Just work." She began to sweep. It was an awkward, waddling motion. Her belly threw off her balance. Every stroke of the broom sent a spasm of pain through her lower back. She swept the dirt toward the hearth. She wiped down the table with the hem of her apron. She saw the water basin on the washstand. It was empty. There was a large cast-iron kettle on the floor, half full of water from the morning, likely frozen over. "He needs hot water for coffee," she thought. "Or tea. I can make tea." She went to the kettle. She bent her knees trying to lift it. It was heavy, too heavy. As she pulled, her wet boots slipped on the smooth stone floor. "Ah!" Elara pitched forward. The kettle clamored against the stone. She flailed, her hands instinctively going to her belly to protect it from the impact. She braced for the hard fall, squeezed her eyes shut. A wall of heat slammed into her. A massive arm caught her across the chest, holding her up before her knees could hit the ground. Elara gasped, her eyes flying open. Silas was there. He had come back and silently, the wind masking his entry. He held her suspended, his grip iron hard but surprisingly gentle. He smelled of cold air and wet wool. He didn't yell. He didn't scowl. He looked down at her, his face inches from hers. His amber eyes searched her face, checking for pain, checking for fear. "What are you doing?" he rumbled. His voice was low, vibrating against her ribs. I was trying to... the kettle," Elara stammered, her heart hammering against his arm. "I wanted to help, to work. I know I have to work." Silas set her upright. He kept his hand on her shoulder for a second longer than necessary, steadying her. "You nearly fell," he said flatly. "I can do it," Elara insisted, tears of frustration welling up. "I'm strong, Mr. Thorne. I promise. I'm not useless." Silas looked at the broom on the floor. He looked at the half-swept dirt. He looked at her hands red, chapped and trembling. He looked down at her feet. Her boots were soaked through, dark with water. Above the leather her ankles spilled over, swollen, red and angry. Silas frowned, the scar on his face pulled tight. He didn't say a word. He stepped past her. He picked up the heavy kettle with one hand, as if it were a teacup. He placed it on the hook, over the roaring fire. He walked to the larder and grabbed a handful of dried herbs, mint and willow bark. He tossed them into the water. Elara watched him, confused. "Mr. Thorne!" Silas ignored her. He dragged the heavy wooden chair closer to the fire. "Seat," he commanded. Elara hesitated. "But the floor." "Sit." She sat. The heat from the fire was intense, thawing her frozen skin and making her extremities tingle with returning blood. Silas went to the corner and retrieved a large copper basin. He placed it at her feet. He waited. The kettle began to sing. He took a heavy cloth, grabbed the handle, and poured the steaming herbal water into the basin. He added a scoop of snow from a bucket by the door to temper the heat. He knelt. The mountain man, the bearer of the high timber, went down on one knee before her. "Boots," he said. Elara stared at him. "Mr. Thorne, no, you can't. That's not your job." Silas didn't argue. He reached out with his massive, scarred hands. He took her left foot. He began to unlace the wet leather. His fingers, thick as sausages and calloused from splitting wood, were impossibly dexterous. He loosened the knot. He peeled the sodden leather away from her skin. He stripped off the wet wool sock. Elara's foot was pale, blue-veined, and swollen tight. The skin looked painful to the touch. Silas hissed softly through his teeth. He took her foot in his hand. His palm was rough like sandpaper, but the heat coming off it was incredible. He lifted her foot and lowered it gently into the steaming water. Elara let out a sound that was half gasp, half moan. The heat penetrated the bone. The willow bark scent rose up, soothing and earthy. Silas did the same with the other foot. He didn't leave. He stayed kneeling there, watching the water swirl around her ankles. He reached into the water. He began to massage her foot. He pressed his thumbs into the arch, working out the knot of tension. He wasn't gentle in a tentative way, he was firm, knowing exactly how much pressure to apply. Elara gripped the arms of the chair, her head falling back. The relief was shattering. It broke something inside her, the wall of stoicism she had built since Thomas died. "Why?" she whispered, looking down at the top of his dark head. "Why are you doing this?" Silas didn't look up. He kept working on her heel, his hands moving with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. "Swollen," he grunted, as if that explained everything. "Swell needs heat. Heat brings flow." He paused, his hand resting on her ankle, his thumb brushing the swollen skin. "You do not work," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Not with the little one so close. You sit, you heal, you grow." He looked up then. His eyes met hers. There was no pity in them, no lust, just a fierce, uncompromising protectiveness that terrified her almost as much as the cold. "You are the vessel," he murmured, almost to himself. "The vessel must not crack." He stood up abruptly, water dripping from his hands. He turned away, retreating to the shadows of the cabin to oil his rifle, leaving Elara sitting by the fire, her feet warm, her heart racing, and the realization dawning on her that the monster in the cave might be the only thing standing between her and the abyss. The storm didn't just arrive. It erased the world. For 3 days, the wind screamed like a banshee trapped in the canyon, driving snow into every crack and crevice of the mountain face. The cabin, built into the living rock, groaned under the assault, the massive timbers creaking in protest as the drifts piled higher and higher against the door, sealing them in a tomb of ice and silence. Inside, time had lost its meaning. There was no sunrise, no sunset, only the rhythmic feeding of the fire and the dim golden circle of light cast by the lantern. The air grew heavy and close, smelling of wood smoke, curing leather, and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender Elara had found dried in a jar. Elara sat in the rocking chair Silas had dragged from the shadows. It was a rough thing, carved from hickory with the bark still on, but he had lined it with a soft wolf pelt that cushioned her aching back. In her lap lay a pile of old flour sacks she had found in the larder. They were bleached white and worn soft by age, the perfect fabric for a child who would have nothing else. She pushed the needle through the cloth, her fingers moving with a practiced, rhythmic grace. In, out, in, out. She was sewing a shirt. It was tiny, absurdly small, and looking at it made her chest tighten with a mixture of terror and fierce, overwhelming love. Across the hearth, Silas sat on a 3-legged stool, mending a pack harness. He worked with a terrifying focus. His massive hands, scarred and stained with oil, manipulated the thick leather straps and heavy awl with a surprising delicacy. Punch, thread, pull. The sound of the wax thread snapping taut punctuated the crackle of the fire. He was shirtless in the heat of the room, his suspenders hanging loose at his waist. The firelight danced over the landscape of his torso, a map of muscles and scars that told the story of a life spent fighting the wild. There was a long, pale slash across his ribs where a cougar had missed his throat, a burn mark on his forearm, and the deep, jagged line running down his face, pulling his eye into that permanent, watchful squint. Elara watched him through her lashes. In the beginning, his size had terrified her. He moved like a landslide, heavy and inevitable. But over the last few days of confinement, she had learned the rhythm of him. She learned that he checked the chimney drawer every hour to ensure they wouldn't smoke up. She learned that he saved the softest parts of the venison for her plate. She learned that when he looked at her belly, his expression wasn't one of disgust, but of a profound, terrified awe. He was a monster to the town, but here, in the firelight, He was just a man trying to keep the cold at bay. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Elara's abdomen. "Oh!" she gasped, dropping the needle. Her hands flew to her stomach, clutching the fabric of her dress. The baby had kicked hard, a violent somersault that stole her breath and sent a ripple visible even through the layers of calico. Silas froze. The awl stopped mid-punch. He looked up, his amber eyes instantly alert, scanning her face for danger. "Pain?" he rumbled, his voice rough with disuse. "No," Elara wheezed, rubbing the spot. He's just awake. He's very strong tonight. I think he hates the wind." Silas didn't go back to his work. He set the harness down on the floor. He wiped his hands on a rag, scrubbing away the oil and grit with a frantic thoroughness. He stood up. He loomed over her, blocking the firelight, casting a long shadow across the room. "Strong?" he asked. "Yes." Elara smiled weakly, wincing as another kick caught her in the ribs. "He's trying to kick his way out, I think." Silas hesitated. He looked at her stomach. He looked at his own hand, the hand that had thrown gantry, the hand that had skinned bears, the hand that had known only violence. He took a step closer. "May I?" The question was so quiet, Elara almost didn't hear it over the wind. It hung in the air, fragile and heavy. Elara looked up at him. She saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the storm. He was afraid of this. He was afraid of the life growing inside her. "Yes," she whispered. She took his hand. It engulfed hers, swallowing her fingers in a palm that felt like warm leather. She guided it to her belly, placing it right where the baby was pushing. Silas held his breath. He held his hand perfectly still, terrified to apply even an ounce of his immense strength. For a moment there was nothing, just the heat of her skin and the sound of the fire. Then thump! The baby kicked directly against his palm. Silas jerked his hand back as if he had been burned. His eyes went wide, the pupils blowing out until the amber was almost swallowed by black. "He moved," Silas whispered, staring at his hand. He pushed back. "He knows you're there," Elara said softly. "He knows you're the one keeping the fire going." Silas looked at her. His face crumpled. The stoic mask, the bear's scowl that all fell away, revealing a raw, gaping wound of grief. He sank to his knees. He didn't care about the hard stone. He knelt before her, his head bowed, his hands resting on his thighs, trembling. "I had a son," he rasped. The words sounded like they were being torn out of his throat with rusty hooks. "Years ago, before the mountain." Elara stopped breathing. She reached out and touched his hair. It was coarse and thick. "His name was Samuel," Silas continued, his voice cracking. "And a wife, Sarah. She was small, like you, full of light." He looked at the fire, seeing ghosts in the flames. "The pox came through the valley. It took the town in a week. I was strong. I tried. I tried to hold them. I tried to keep them warm. I hunted. I brought wood." A single tear tracked through the scar on his cheek, getting lost in his beard. "It didn't matter. The sickness doesn't care about strength. It doesn't care about wood. It took Sarah first, then Samuel. He was so small, Elara. He was just a little bird. I held him, and he turned to ice in my arms. I felt his heart stop against my chest." He looked up at her, his eyes swimming with 10 years of unwept tears. "I came up here to die," he confessed. "I came to the timberline because nothing lives here. The cold kills everything. If I stayed in the cold, I couldn't lose anything else, because I had nothing left to lose." He looked at her belly. He looked at the life that was defying the cold, defying the death he had surrounded himself with. "When I saw you on that crate," he whispered, "I saw her. I saw the life, and I heard gantry. speaking of it like it was dirt. He reached out again. This time, he didn't need her guidance. He placed both hands on her stomach, covering the child, shielding it, claiming it. "This one will not freeze," he vowed. The growl was back in his voice, but it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the universe, at death itself. "This one will not starve. I am the bear. I am the wall. Nothing gets past me, not the cold, not the hunger, not the dark." He leaned forward. He pressed his forehead against her stomach, right between his hands. He closed his eyes. "I will not let him turn to ice," Silas promised into her skin. "I will burn the whole world down to keep him warm." Elara wept. She tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to the present, to the life that was beating strong and sure beneath his grief. "We are warm, Silas," she whispered. "We are here. You aren't alone in the cold anymore." The wind howled outside, a furious, impotent beast trying to tear down the walls. Inside, the fire roared, and the man who thought he was death held the promise of life in his hands, and for the first time in a decade, the ice around his heart began to crack. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The dawn broke not with light, but with a bruising of the eastern sky, a deep, sickly violet that bled into the gray of the retreating storm. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against the eardrums like deep water. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of the morning's work. Elara stood by the stove, her back aching in a new, rhythmic way that she was trying hard to ignore. She was rendering tallow in a heavy cast-iron pot, the fat bubbling and spitting, transforming into the lye soap they would need for the baby's linens. The acrid, biting scent of the lye mixed with the wood smoke, a sharp chemical tang that stung the back of her throat. Silas was at the window. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night pacing, a restless shadow moving between the hearth and the door. He was cleaning his rifle, a Winchester 1873 that looked small in his massive hands. Click-clack. Swipe. Click-clack. The sound was hypnotic and terrifying. "Silas?" Elara whispered, stirring the pot with a long wooden paddle. "You need to eat. The venison is warm." Silas didn't turn. He was staring out through the thick, distorted glass of the single window, watching the tree line where the snowdrifts were piled high as a man's chest. "Birds," he rumbled. "What?" "The jays. They're gone. Something flushed them." Elara froze, the paddle dripping hot fat back into the pot. "A wolf?" "Two-legged wolves," Silas growled. He turned from the window. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying resolve. The vulnerability she had seen last night, the grief for his lost son, it was gone. In its place was the bear, the predator. "Cellar," he commanded. "Silas, Now!" The shout cracked through the room just as the first shot shattered the window. Crash! Glass exploded inward, spraying across the floor like diamond dust. A bullet thudded into the log wall inches from Silas's head, sending a spray of splinters into his hair. "Get down!" Silas roared, lunging across the room. He didn't run, he blurred. He grabbed Elara, shielding her body with his own massive bulk, and shoved her toward the trapdoor hidden beneath the rug in the pantry alcove. Outside, a voice echoed off the canyon walls, high, thin, and filled with a manic, greedy triumph. "Morning, Thorn." It was Gantry. "We've come for the widow. Sheriff says you kidnapped her. Surrender the girl and the location of that platinum vein, and maybe we won't burn you out." Silas ripped the rug aside. He hauled the heavy trapdoor open with one hand. "Go," he hissed, his amber eyes burning into hers. "Do not come out. No matter what you hear, do not make a sound." "Silas, there are too many of them," Elara cried, clutching his arm. "Please, don't go out there." They touched the perimeter, Silas snarled, checking the load in his rifle. They woke the bear. He pushed her gently but firmly down the ladder. Protect the cub. He slammed the door shut. Darkness swallowed her. Elara huddled at the bottom of the ladder, the smell of damp earth and root vegetables surrounding her. She could hear the muffled shouts from above, the heavy thud of boots on the porch, and then— boom! Silas fired. The sound was deafening even in the cellar. A scream followed short, sharp, and cut off abruptly. Above her, the cabin became a war zone. She heard the crash of the front door being kicked in. She heard the roar of Silas, a sound that wasn't human, a guttural bellow of pure protective rage. Clang. The sound of metal on metal. The axe. Silas was using the felling axe. He's crazy, a man shrieked. Shoot the Urk. Another scream. The sound of something heavy hitting the floorboards. The cabin shook with the violence of the struggle. Elara pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face, rocking back and forth on her heels. Please. Please let him live. Please. Outside, the snow was turning red. Silas Thorne had gone feral. He had burst through the door, not with caution, but with the momentum of a landslide. He took the first bullet in the meat of his shoulder, a grazing shot that only served to stoke the fire in his blood. He didn't feel it. He swung the rifle stock like a club, shattering the jaw of the first hired gun who tried to rush the porch. The man went down, spitting teeth and blood into the snow. Gantry was screaming from the safety of the tree line. Kill him! He's just one man! Get the girl! The sheriff, a man named Miller who had sold his badge to the bank years ago, leveled a shotgun. Silas saw him. He didn't dodge. He grabbed the barrel of the shotgun with his bare hand, ignoring the heat of the metal, and wrenched it upward. The blast tore a hole in the porch roof. With a roar, Silas drove his knee into Miller's gut. The sheriff folded. Silas grabbed him by the collar and belt and physically threw him off the porch into a drift of snow that hid one of his bear traps. Snap! The steel jaw slammed shut on Miller's leg. The scream that tore out of the sheriff's throat was a high, thin wail that echoed endlessly in the cold air. But there were more of them. Gantry had brought 5 men. 2 were down. 3 remained. Silas pulled his felling axe from the woodpile. He stood on the porch, blood dripping from his shoulder, steam rising from his body in the freezing air. He looked like a demon. Come on, he bellowed, swinging the axe in a wide, lethal arc. Come and take her! 2 of the gunmen hesitated, terrified by the sheer, brutal violence of the mountain man. But the third, a wiry, rat-faced tracker named Skeeter, saw his opening. While Silas was engaged with the 2 in front, Skeeter slipped around the side of the cabin. He found the wood chute. It was too small for a man, but the window above it wasn't. He smashed the remaining glass and vaulted inside. Elara heard the boots hit the floorboards above her. She froze. The fighting was still raging on the porch, heavy thuds, shouts, the ring of the axe, but these footsteps were light, sneaky. They moved across the floor. They stopped. They were right above the trapdoor. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it would crack them. She looked around the cellar for a weapon. A jar of pickles? A sack of potatoes? Useless. Then she remembered. The lye soap. She had been rendering it when the attack started. Silas hadn't had time to move the pot. It was still on the stove, heavy cast iron, filled with boiling fat and caustic lye. The trapdoor creaked. A sliver of light appeared, then wider. Skeeter's face appeared in the opening. He grinned, revealing yellow, rotting teeth. He held a long, skinning knife in his hand. Well, well, he whispered, peering into the gloom. Found the honey pot. Gantry said you was heavy, girl. Didn't say you was hiding in a hole. He swung his legs over the edge of the opening, preparing to drop down. "Come on out, widow," he sneered, "unless you want me to cut that belly open and see what makes you so slow." Something inside Alara snapped. It was the same snap she had felt when Gantry touched her arm in the square, but this time there was no fear, only a cold, white-hot rage. This man wasn't just threatening her, he was threatening the child. He was threatening the only future she had left. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't just a vessel. She was the mother of a mountain man's son. "I said, come out," Skeeter hissed, starting to descend the ladder. Elora didn't move away. She moved forward. She grabbed the handle of the heavy iron ladle she had brought down with her. She hadn't even realized she was still clutching it. It was coated in the cooling but still caustic soap mixture. No, that wasn't enough. She looked at the small pot-bellied stove in the corner of the cellar. Silas kept it there to keep the root vegetables from freezing. On top of it sat a bucket of water, kept near boiling to add humidity to the dry air. Elora grabbed the bucket. It was heavy. Her back screamed, her belly strained. But she lifted it. Skeeter was halfway down the ladder. He looked down, expecting to see a cowering woman. Instead, he saw Elora Vance, eyes wide with fury, heaving a gallon of scalding water upward. "Get out!" she screamed. She threw the water. Skeeter shrieked, dropping the knife. He clawed at his face, blinding pain searing his eyes and skin. He lost his footing on the ladder. He fell backward. He hit the dirt floor of the cellar with a sickening crunch, his head striking the edge of the potato bin. He thrashed for a second, moaning, hands covering his scalded face, and then went still. Elora stood over him, heaving for breath, the empty bucket clutched in her hands like a shield. She watched him. He didn't move. Above her, the noise of the battle had changed. The gunshots had stopped. The shouting had turned into moans of pain. Then silence. A heavy dragging step sounded on the floorboards above. "Elora?" It was Silas. His voice was a wreck wet and ragged. "Silas," she cried out, her voice breaking. "I'm here. He came down." The face of the bear appeared in the trapdoor opening. He was terrifying, blood smeared across his forehead, his shirt torn to ribbons, his eyes wild and dilated. He looked down. He saw the unconscious gunman on the floor. He saw the steam rising from the man's face. He saw Elora standing there, fierce and shaking, the bucket still raised. He didn't ask what happened. He understood. He reached a hand down. It was covered in blood, not his own. "Take my hand," he rasped. "The wolves are gone." Elora dropped the bucket. She reached up. Silas gripped her hand with a strength that bruised, pulling her up from the dark, out of the cellar, and into a room that had been shattered by violence but was now finally still. She climbed out and looked at him. He was swaying. There was a dark stain spreading across the side of his ribs, soaking the waistband of his trousers. "Silas," she whispered, reaching for him, "you're hurt." "Just a scratch," he lied, his knees buckling. He slumped against her. Elora caught him. She groaned under the sudden immense weight, her own body protesting, a sharp, searing cramp wrapping around her abdomen like a vice. Water gushed down her legs, soaking her dress and pooling on the blood-spattered floor. Silas looked down, his eyes widening in panic. "The vessel," he whispered, terror replacing the rage in his face. "No," Elora gasped, clutching his arm as another contraction hit her, hard enough to steal her vision. "Not the vessel, Silas. The sun. He's coming. Now." The pain wasn't a wave. It was a landslide. It started in the small of Elora's back, a grinding tectonic shift that radiated outward, seizing her hips and crushing the air from her lungs. She gasped, her fingers digging into the wool of Silas's sleeve. her knees buckling under the sudden immense pressure of the descent. "Bed," Silas rasped. He didn't wait for her to nod. He swept her up, ignoring the fresh blood soaking his own flank, ignoring the exhaustion that turned his face gray. He carried her to the corner, laying her down on the pile of furs that had been his only comfort for a decade. "The window," Elara panted, clutching her stomach as the contraction peaked. "The cold, the baby." The wind was shrieking through the shattered glass, driving snow into the room, threatening to turn the sanctuary into an icebox. Silas turned. He looked at the window, then at the heavy oak table. He didn't bother with tools. He grabbed the table by its legs, his muscles cording with strain, and dragged it across the floor. With a roar of effort that tore fresh blood from his side, he tipped it up, slamming it against the window frame, blocking the wind. He grabbed a hammer and nails from the mantel and drove them into the wood, bang, 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 sealing the breach. The silence returned, heavy and expectant. He turned back to her. He looked terrified. The man who had faced down a posse with an axe, the man who had fought a grizzly with a knife, stood trembling at the foot of the bed. I do not know the way of this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Sarah, the midwife came. I was sent to chop wood. I only heard the screams." "There is no midwife," Elara grit out, sweat beading on her forehead despite the chill. "There is only us. You have to be the hand, Silas. You have to catch him." Silas nodded, a jerky mechanical motion. He went to the stove. He pumped water into a basin. He threw more wood on the fire until the heat was stifling, a wall of warmth against the winter. He washed his hands, scrubbing them with the lye soap until they were raw and red, trying to wash away the blood of the men he had killed to protect this moment. He knelt at the foot of the bed. "I am here," he said. It sounded like a prayer. The hours that followed were a blur of agony and endurance. Time dissolved into a rhythm of pain and respite. Elara fought. She fought with the same ferocity she had used in the cellar. She didn't scream. She groaned, a low, guttural sound that matched the wind outside. Silas was her anchor. When she drifted into the haze of exhaustion, his voice pulled her back. "Stay with me, Elara. The summit is close. Keep climbing." He wiped her face with a cool cloth. He held her hand when the pain was too much, letting her crush his fingers, absorbing her suffering into his own scarred body. He checked her progress with terrifying gentleness, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. Then the change happened. The pain shifted from a dull ache to a ring of fire. "He's coming," Elara gasped, arching her back. "Silas, he's coming." "I see him," Silas said, his voice shaking. "I see the head, dark hair like a raven." "Push," Elara told herself. "Push for his life." She pushed. She gave everything she had left, every ounce of strength, every hope she had carried up the mountain. Silas watched. He saw the life emerging from the woman who had become his world. He remembered Samuel Blue and Silent. The terror of that memory clawed at his throat, threatening to choke him. Not this time, he vowed silently. Not this time. "One more," he urged, his hands positioned to receive the child. "Bring him home, Elara." With a final shattering cry, Elara pushed. The baby slid out. Silas caught him. He was slippery, warm, and heavy. For a second, an eternity that stretched longer than the winter, there was silence. The baby was still, purple. "Silas?" Elara whispered, lifting her head, terror flooding her eyes. Silas didn't hesitate. He turned the infant over. He used his large calloused finger to clear the tiny mouth. He rubbed the small back vigorously with a rough cloth. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice breaking. "Breathe, little bear. Fight." The baby twitched. Then he drew in a breath that seemed to pull all the air from the room. The cry was loud, angry, indignant. It was the most beautiful sound Silas had ever heard. It shattered the ghosts of the past. It broke the curse of the cabin. "He lives," Silas wept, tears streaming freely down his blood-streaked face. "He lives." He wrapped the boy in the soft flour sack shirt Alara had sewn. He bundled him in a warm rabbit skin. He walked to the head of the bed and placed the screaming bundle into Alara's arms. Alara looked down. Her son. He was red-faced, furious, and perfect. He had a shock of black hair and eyes that were squeezed shut against the light. "He's beautiful," she whispered, touching his cheek. She looked up at Silas. He was swaying. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only the blood loss and the pain. His side was soaked in crimson. "Silas," she said sharply, "you're bleeding." "It is nothing," he murmured, sitting heavily on the floor beside the bed, unable to stand any longer. The price of admission. "Come here," she ordered, shifting to make room. "Sit on the bed. Let me see." He didn't argue. He sat on the edge of the mattress. Alara handed the baby to him. He took the boy with a reverence that was heartbreaking, and she reached for the whiskey bottle and the bandages. She cleaned his wound. It was a gouge across his ribs, deep and ugly, but it hadn't pierced the lung. She bound it tight. "You need rest," she said, her hand lingering on his arm. "I need to stand guard," he mumbled, his eyes drooping. "The wolves." "The wolves are dead," Alara said firmly. "Sleep, Silas. We are safe." He looked at her. He looked at the baby in his arms, and for the first time in 10 years, the bear closed his eyes and slept without a weapon in his hand. The sun that rose the next morning was blinding. It reflected off the fresh snow, turning the world into a canvas of white and gold. The storm had broken. The sky was a piercing, impossible blue. Silas woke with a start, his hand instantly reaching for his knife. But there was no danger. Only the sound of the fire popping and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the woman and child beside him. He looked at them. Alara was asleep, her hair spread like a halo across the furs. The baby was tucked in the crook of her arm, his tiny fist gripping the fabric of her dress. Silas felt a panic rise in his chest, a terrifying, suffocating panic. "I cannot keep them," he thought. "I am death. I am violence. Look at the blood on the floor. Look at the broken window. I almost got them killed." He stood up, wincing as his side pulled. He walked to the door and opened it. The cold air hit him, clearing his head. Alara stirred. She opened her eyes. She saw him standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. "Silas?" He didn't turn. "The snow will melt in a week," he said, his voice flat. "The pass will be clear. I will saddle the horse. I will take you to the railhead in Silverton. You have the platinum. You can buy a house, a real house, with a fence." Alara sat up slowly, wincing. She pulled the blanket around the baby. "You're sending us away?" "I am saving you," Silas roared, turning to face her. "Look at this place, Alara. It is a cave. It is a tomb. Men come here to kill me. I am a lightning rod for violence. If you stay, the boy will bleed. I cannot watch another son die." He was shaking. The terror of the past was clawing at him, telling him that love was just a prelude to loss. Alara looked at him. She saw the fear. She saw the love beneath it. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, but she locked her knees. She walked across the room, the baby in her arms. She stopped in front of him. "You think I want a fence?" she asked quietly. "I had a fence in Black Creek. It didn't keep the dead out. It didn't keep the shame out." She touched his chest, right over his heart. "You think you are death," she said, "but you are the one who caught him. You are the one who breathed life into him." He looked down at the baby. "His name is Silas," she said. The mountain man froze. No, no, you cannot. That is a cursed name. It is a strong name, Alara corrected. It is the name of the man who saved us. The name of the man who stood between us and the wolves. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce and dry. I am not going to Silverton, Silas. I am not going anywhere. This is my home. You are my home. If you want us to leave, you will have to throw us out into the snow yourself. Silas stared at her. He looked at the baby little Silas, who yawned, opening his eyes. They were amber, just like his. The wall inside him crumbled. The fortress he had built around his heart, stone by stone, for 10 years turned to dust. He let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He reached out and wrapped his massive arms around them both, pulling them into his chest, burying his face in Alara's neck. My pack, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. My blood. Your family, Alara whispered back, leaning into his warmth. Epilogue 3 years later. The summer sun was warm on the granite shelf. The snow was a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant purple of fireweed and the yellow of mountain arnica. The cabin had changed. The broken window was gone, replaced by clear glass that caught the morning light. A porch had been added, sturdy and wide, with a railing of peeled pine. A garden grew in raised beds near the door, hardy potatoes, carrots, and herbs that smelled of peace. A little boy, sturdy and black-haired, ran across the porch, brandishing a stick like a sword. Papa! Papa! The eagle is back! Silas Thorne emerged from the woodshed. He wasn't wearing the bear coat. He wore a simple flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars that had faded to silver. He dropped the armload of wood and scooped the boy up, swinging him high into the air. Is he? Silas laughed, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. We better tell Mama. Alara stepped out onto the porch. She was wiping her hands on an apron, her face fuller, healthier, glowing with the mountain sun. She smiled as she watched them, the giant and the boy. Silas lowered the child but didn't let him go. He walked up the steps, his arm going around Alara's waist, pulling her close. The town of Black Creek was a distant memory, a smudge of smoke in the valley below. They never went down. Traders came up, men who spoke respectfully to the bear and his wife, men who knew that the platinum mine was guarded by something far more dangerous than a gun, a family that had walked through the fire and come out the other side, forged in iron and love. Soup's on, Alara said, kissing Silas's cheek. We're coming, Silas said. He looked out over the valley one last time, his hand resting on the head of his son, his arm holding his wife. The silence of the mountain wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was loud. It was home.